we're going to spend some time talking about one of the mechanisms, or I shouldn't say mechanisms, one of the means of evolution, which is microevolution. So what is it that evolves? Evolution occurs at the level of populations, not individual organisms. So populations are groups of individuals within a particular geographical region. So again, evolution happens at the population level. This is a question I'm going to ask you on the test. But populations that become reproductively isolated, meaning that they're not interbreeding with one another, can evolve independently and in different ways. So just because it's reproductively isolated doesn't actually mean, by the way, that they're becoming physically separated by a barrier. There is a type of speciation called sympatric speciation or sympatric evolution, where species are evolving within the same area. So here's an example of how that reproductive isolation can take place. This is a reproductive barrier happening. Here you have the original environment and the original coloration of these frogs, but you're having barren terrain sort of expand throughout the middle of their ecosystem. And so frogs over here, these B population, are not able to reproduce with this A population. And because these forests are different from one another, you see this forest is darker. These frogs on the bee population are ultimately going to turn a darker green, and they're going to develop different reproductive strategies. They're going to develop different ecological strategies. They're just going to evolve in an independent way from population A over here, which is much larger because, again, it lives in a light-colored area. These are reproductively isolated because they cannot pass through this expanse of barren terrain. These frogs can't get over to these frogs to try to reproduce with them. So how is it that evolution takes place? It is because of mutations in alleles. Remember, alleles are variant forms of these genes. Each individual has 2 alleles for each gene. You get one from your mom, you get one from your dad. All alleles in a population collectively constitute the gene pool. So every allele in a population is the gene pool. Genetic variation is produced by mutation. Mutation is the raw material for evolution. So mutations take place, leading us to have different forms of these alleles. So here are our same frogs from that previous example, and you can just kind of see here, these alleles have changed into different alleles from these dark frogs to these lighter frogs. All right, here's the section on their chromosome of their maternal and paternal alleles, or here's the maternal and paternal chromosomes that cause them to be dark, and you can see they're different from these lighter colored ones over here. So microevolution, what this chapter is about, refers to a change in allele frequency, the number of big A's and little a's, or the number of big B's and little b's in a population over time. Macroevolution is talking about changes in patterns of evolutions or large-scale evolution, like actual species formation, which we're going to get to in a subsequent chapter. But microevolution is the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. So there's this idea that a lot of folks look to called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. It's from these mathematicians, Hardy and Weinberg, from the early 20th century, and they discovered, or they figured out, that allele frequencies will not change unless evolution is taking place. So if you don't have these 5 agents of microevolution, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, allele frequencies will not take place. So if you don't have any of these agents of evolution, you will not have microevolution. So they have these species of 2 flowers, much like Gregor Mendel, and they are crossing them. They know what the alleles are. They know what the genotypes are. And they discovered that the allele frequencies in this population stayed exactly the same over time. So this is just them crossing these various flowers and figuring out what the different genotypes are, what the different phenotypes are. So the Hardy-Weinberg equation is that p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. And we're going to talk about this equation in lab at some point. This is kind of a convoluted and honestly not a great way of calculating allele frequencies. Hopefully we'll have time this summer and we'll be able to do this actually together. So allele frequency in a population can change in response to 5 different evolutionary forces. I referenced these just a minute ago. The first evolutionary force is mutation. So if you have a mutation, it's going to create new alleles. There's a slow rate of mutation, and most mutations are neutral. Some are deleterious that will kill you, and very few are actually beneficial. So the first thing you need for microevolution to take place is mutation. Gene flow can also help from this. This is movement of alleles from one population to another through migration. So that an example of this would be those frogs that were separated by that barren landmass. If frogs can start coming across there, then you can have gene flow starting to take place, and evolution, microevolution will happen. So we also have this next one, which is genetic drift, which sounds like gene flow, but it is not. Genetic drift is not the same thing as gene flow. Genetic drift is the random change in allele frequencies. Genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies. So an example of this would be if there's a whole bunch of ants digging and doing ant stuff, and a tree falls and kills half of them. That's going to be a complete random change in allele frequencies for no reason at all. It didn't have anything to do with those ants. It didn't have anything to do with their phenotypes or their genotypes or how good they were at finding food. It was just random. The tree just fell and killed half of them, okay? Taking away a bunch of alleles. So genetic drift is that random change in allele frequency. So here's an example. There's a bunch of penguins in here, and you can see some of them are like these red ones, okay? What it's doing here is it's telling you that if you have a large population like this and you kill off half of them, there's not going to be a big change to your allele frequencies. Whereas if you have a very small population like this one and you kill off half of them, you can completely lose out on a segment of your genetic diversity. These red guys, after you kill off half these penguins, are just gone. So if it's a small population, this drift, this random loss of alleles is going to have a much larger impact than if it's a large population. We also have this notion of the bottleneck effect, which is where there is some usually dramatic event that narrows the population way, way down. This is a kind of genetic drift. And so after you bottleneck these seals down, you're only left with brown and white, and so these black seals are just eliminated from the population. And actually these gray seals are eliminated from the population as well. So it's kind of a form of genetic drift. It is called the bottleneck effect, and it reduces the amount of diversity that you have, generally speaking. The next is non-random mating. So this is going to be individuals reproducing with some individuals other than others. Okay, so this is saying, well, females prefer to mate with some other individuals. And there are actually a lot of populations where you do have random mating. That would be like fish just releasing their gametes into the water, and just whatever it gets fertilized by is what it gets fertilized by. But again, this non-random mating is another agent of microevolution. It can cause there to be a change in allele frequencies. Just having two individuals have a preference for a different individual to mate with can cause a change in these allele frequencies. And here, this is just a picture of some sexual selection. You've got these birds that look similar to one another that fancy each other. The next agent is natural selection. And so if you have natural selection, if you have some alleles being selected on, it's going to cause those to be more popular. So let's say you have a whole bunch of squirrels, and any squirrel that weighs less than a pound gets wiped out. You're going to have larger and larger squirrels in your population. That is going to lead to an increase in those alleles. So essays, there's lessons from the Cocker Spaniel, the price of inbreeding. So this is an interesting kind of aside from what we're talking about here, but if you are massively inbred, you're going to wind up with all of the same exact alleles. You're going to wind up with all the same exact alleles, and you're not going to be very diverse. And any deleterious alleles that your parents had but were protected from because they were heterozygous are going to be passed on to you much more often. So the point of this little essay is just that inbreeding is not good, and that 25% of purebred dogs have some serious genetic defects. And you see that all the time. It's probably that number's worse by now. Um, they have bad hips, they have problems with breathing, they just have a lot of issues. So here are our various agents of microevolution. You have mutation, okay? That is the change in DNA causing you to have different alleles. You have gene flow, which is different populations mixing with one another through migration. You have genetic drift, which sounds like gene flow, but is not. Genetic drift is this idea of losing alleles just by chance. You have non-random mating, which is certain individuals selecting who they're mating with, which causes a shift in your allele frequencies. And then you have natural selection, which is where certain traits are selected on, certain traits are removed from a population. So these are the 5 things that cause these are the 5 things that cause evolution to take place.